Hi folks, Dr. P here, and this is an unusual video because I'm going to talk about what should, quote unquote, be in an RPG design book. So somehow I've got the idea of writing a 100,000 word book about role-playing game design, though this is not the first time I've thought about this. The last time was in 2017, I think. Actually, a great deal of it has already been written in my old articles, in videos, hundreds of videos, and the Worlds of Design column, plus stuff that I've written that has not been published. Well, this book might pair well with my 2012 book, Game Design, How to Create Video and Tabletop Games, which is still in print because it still sells. Now, I prefer small to medium books that people might actually read, hence the limit to 100,000 words. The average novel is 90 to 100,000 words. The question is, what would people expect in such a book? Because I have far more material than I have space. Well, we first should ask, what goes into an RPG, the actual game? This is about game design. Well, an RPG can have up to 3 parts, but can do with just the first. The first is the RPG rules, the mechanisms. You can't have a role-playing game without that. You can have something else, but not a role-playing game. The second that might be in the game is a description of a world or setting. The third could be sample adventures or how to GM advice, or both. So why a setting? Well, some games rely on a default setting. For example, D&D's default is medieval with magic and monsters. But the publisher has released many other settings. Still, everything references back to that default, which is kind of the default setting for fantasy novels in general. A World War II RPG would have a World War II setting. A Tolkien RPG would have a Middle-earth setting, etc. And there are RPGs that are as much or more the setting as the rules. For example, Dystopia Rising is very heavily focused on the setting rather than the rules. And the rules, unfortunately, are not very good. And you have everywhere in between. Now, when you write a role-playing game, sometimes you expect the reader to know how to GM already, and some you don't. For example, if you have a heavily storytelling game, then you might want to provide advice to the reader about storytelling. And we have to recognize that there's at least one book by Alex McCree, who designed Conqueror King system, that's all about GMing, at least in a general sense. And you can include adventures, and the adventures themselves might include advice about how to make stories, or we can assume that the readers already know how to make an adventure. And a sample adventure included in the rules may be a compromise. Now, what about the book? If this that I've just described is what the role-playing game can be, what should the book be? Now, clearly a book must discuss game design generally and role-playing game design specifically at length. This is not a problem for me. I've written a lot about this and of course have a book about it. But what about the rest of the possibilities? World building. There are books and many long videos about world building. It's of great interest to some aspiring novelists, and that, I think, is the main reason why there is so much material. But it's also quite complicated, and yet it's not directly related to the game. Too many GMs concern themselves more with their world than with actual gameplay. So their adventures are, look at what I've made, instead of actual adventures. So I think less emphasis on the world may be better than more. I think world building may be a matter of what space is available in the book. Adventure making. Again, there are entire books about video game level creation. and innumerable books about writing stories. Perhaps an example adventure would be better than extensive advice. Recall, Advanced D&D included a sample adventure, as well as tables to help create adventures. What about how to GM? Well, that could be a problem when the space available is only 100,000 words. Now, how about including an actual complete role-playing game with commentary about its design? I think this might be especially useful, but it has to be short and simple if only to fit in the book. And I do have one that has been partially tested. I originally wrote it to accompany a board game, but decided that it wasn't practical because the board game wouldn't have a GM. And so I have this very simple game that makes a lot of sense in many respects. Of course, there are lots of subsidiary possibilities. For example, would you expect to see lots of dice tables in a book about RPG design? I wouldn't. What about a glossary? There's a glossary in my general game design book. So, folks, I seek your comments. What do you think must be in or must not be in a book about role-playing game design? Thanks for listening.